Hello and welcome back for part 2 of this hybrid body Chimera build. And we start by continuing some work on the neck. First off, I've got a couple of depth markers set at both the top and bottom of the neck, and I'm just using an angle grinder here to remove the bulk of the material in between. And after that I'm going to refine it a bit more by hand with a saw rasp. So I'm coming in with a saw rasp and squaring up the back side of the neck. And I decided to try a little bit different type of neck carve than what I usually do for this build. So this is somewhat inspired by what I see on Strandberg guitars, where it's 3 facets. There's one on the back and then 2 angled ones on the sides. Only I didn't quite go that far. I left the very back of the neck flat, but the edges going up to the sides of the fretboard are still curved. I actually find it quite comfortable to play. So now with the rough shaping done, I'm just going to clean it up with a random orbital sander. Now that that's done, I'm going in with a round file and carving in the volute. Normally I would carve in the volute before sanding the rest of the neck, but I wanted to be sure that the neck actually felt comfortable before I went ahead and did this carving. And again, I'm coming in with the random orbital sander to refine that shape a bit. So now I begin cutting the fret slots. Now the way I like to cut fret slots, I always do it by hand. I know people tell me use a miter saw. I don't have a miter saw. I don't have any place to put a miter saw. And doing it by hand really isn't that difficult. So I've got the location for the fret slots all marked out already. I've cut them into place with a knife so that the saw has something to follow. And then what I do is I make a small cut at each end of the fret slot and then join them across the middle. And that's a fairly simple way of making sure that your fret slots are all, parallel to one another. and that none of them end up at a weird angle. Of course, I also have a piece of masking tape on the other side of the saw that you couldn't see there that's acting as a depth gauge. So I'm getting ready to sand in the radius for the fretboard. This is going to be a 12-inch radius. And I'm just beginning by marking up the whole fretboard with a pencil so that I can see exactly how much of the fretboard is left to be radiused. Now at this point I'm coming in with some finer grit sandpaper just to smooth out the fretboard itself. And that was a really nice piece of ebony. Alright, so here I'm beginning to cut out the space for the inlay, and this is just a Dremel with a precision router base and a very small router bit. I've drilled a couple of pilot holes just to get the bit in without it jumping around and possibly tearing out parts of the fretboard that I don't want removed. And the inlay is, again, of course, my logo, and I've been using it for at least 10 years now. Of course, even the very smaller outer bits don't quite make the sharp corners that I'm looking for, so I have to go in with a chisel afterward and clean up and refine the shape a bit. And now there is actually a reason that I did all of this inlay work after the fretboard was radiused rather than before. That's because I have a very small amount of the inlay material that I'm going to be using, and I don't want to sand through any of it, so by doing this after the radius is in, I can make sure that the space I cut for the inlay is a consistent depth all throughout, and that I will definitely not end up sanding through or carving through any of it if I went in to radius the neck later. So for this guitar, I decided to try a different type of inlay from the last two. Since the last two were a resin pour, which I'm not extremely thrilled with the results of, this time I'm doing a crushed stone inlay. So for the bird in the center here, I'm using opal. And this is opal that was produced in a lab, although it is chemically and physically identical to naturally formed opal. In hindsight, I should have ground up some of this opal into smaller pieces that could more thoroughly fill this inlay space, but at the time it just wasn't really an option. So instead I've used a lot of ebony dust to kind of fill in the gaps, which still looks relatively natural for the most part, but I think it would have looked better if I had crushed up some of the opal to fill more completely. And once all that is in there, I'm just flooding some thin CA glue over it to just seal it all in place and fill in the gaps. So now I'm moving on to the outer ring, and for this I'm using crushed turquoise. Mainly the reason for the split and using two different materials is because I really didn't have very much of the opal and didn't think there was enough of it to do the whole thing. But I still like how this came out, and I think it fits really well with the overall kind of theme of this build, which is the hybrid nature of the whole thing. So, two different types of inlay, two different types of wood for the body. A two-tone stain on the body, fading from one color to another. Again, I've somewhat filled these cavities with some ebony dust, and then going to put in the turquoise and flood the thin CA glue over it. And the ebony dust actually works out really nicely with the turquoise, since in a lot of cases you expect turquoise to have those black streaks in it, and the ebony dust just perfectly replicates those black streaks that you would expect to see. So now just filling in the other two spaces and getting ready to glue them in again. So after leaving this to dry for a while, I've filled it in a bit more with some more ebony dust and a few more bits of turquoise. And now I'm coming in and sanding it all level with the rest of the fretboard using my leveling beam with some 80 grit sandpaper on it. Needs a bit of fine sanding, but it's pretty much there. Alright, so at this point I was noticing a few small little gaps, and I'm trying to find some specific pieces of the opal that I can just get to fit into those spaces to fill it out. This was quite a tedious and time-consuming process. And so once I was relatively satisfied with having the gaps filled in with some more material, just putting a bit more super glue over it to seal it all in place. That's the downside of doing this after the fret slots were cut, is that, of course, they're filling up with dust and super glue, and I'm going to have to clean them out again, but having the fret slots cut first also helps me make sure that I'm doing this inlay in the correct place. You can see here with the super glue going over the opal just how much it shines once it's actually cleaned up. And again, having to come in and sand it all flat. Now, surprisingly, the stones weren't even that difficult to sand through. It was getting all the super glue off that was the annoying part. And now I'm coming in with the radius block once again with some finer grit sandpaper just to make the whole thing smooth. And of course now I have to come in and clean out those fret slots. Again, it was a pleasant surprise that cutting through these stones with the saw was actually not very difficult at all. But that does it for part 2 of this hybrid guitar build. So thank you everybody for watching, and hope to see you again for the next one.